Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television Saturdays and Sundays, Sunday at 8:30 in the morning, repeated again at 4:30 in the afternoon, and of course also at WichitaLiberty.org, my site. There you can find show notes for today's episode, all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, and all the other content that I and others produce on nearly a daily basis. Today we've got co-host Carl Peterjohn, thank you, and our special guest is Lawrence W. Reed, who is president of FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education. Before that, he was president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy in Michigan. He also taught economics at Northwood University in Michigan and was chair of that Department of Economics. He's widely published in newspapers, magazines, and journals, and is a frequent guest on all sorts of broadcast media. He has authored or co-authored 8 books. Here's one, A Republic, if we can keep it, and travels the nation and the world delivering speeches. He holds degrees from Grove City College and Slippery Rock State University and has 2 honorary doctorate degrees, one from Central Michigan University and also Northwood University. So Larry Reed of FEE, thank you for appearing and welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you, Bob and Karl.
So FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, what is that? What's it all about?
We are a private educational nonprofit. We've been around since 1946, and for most of that time headquartered in New York. But a few years ago, we moved everything to Atlanta, Georgia. Our focus is on young people in high school and college, and we educate and inspire them with ideas of individual liberty, free markets, small government, and personal character.
That's interesting, and I know your founder, Leonard Reed, different spelling and not a relation, right after World War II, and really one of the oldest libertarian think tanks, isn't it?
It is. I think there might be 2 others that predate us, but not by much.
And I think Leonard Reed also is the author of the famous pamphlet, I Pencil, which I think we'll have a moment to talk about. But here in Wichita, one of the talks you're giving today is one titled around a book of yours called Are We Good Enough for Liberty? And I don't know, I thought liberty made us good, but I think one of the sentences you wrote was, if you value liberty, you must understand that character is an indispensable ingredient, a necessary precondition for a free society. So that seems like a big burden, is it?
Well, it is, but it so happens, I think, that liberty is the only social or political economic arrangement that requires that we live to high standards of character. That's because only in liberty must you be honest and patient and responsible and courageous. And if you're not, you're probably not going to have liberty for very long. I don't know of any civilization in all of history that lost its character and kept its liberties. And I know of many civilizations who allowed their character to erode and lost their liberties as a direct result.
So we see turmoil around the world. I'm thinking of maybe Venezuela today. Does that loss of character, do you think it applies to Venezuela and is perhaps causing their problems?
It certainly does. There had to be a point, I don't know Venezuelan history well enough to say exactly when or how, but there had to be a point when people put their faith not so much in themselves anymore, but in the promises of the state. There had to be a point where people thought, I'm willing to give up my freedom if the government will give me something for it. And to me, that's a sign of the erosion of character. People of good character maintain their personal independence. They want to be responsible. They want to take charge of their lives. They don't look to the government as a source of other people's goodies that government can give them. So at some point, character plays a crucial role in deciding whether a society is going to be free or whether it's going to be run by tyrants.
That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody, down to the last man and woman, and of course children are, I think, probably a different case, that they have to be totally self-sufficient, does it? Because that's one character is a characterization of libertarians, I think, that's unfair, that we want to move to Montana, live by ourselves on the top of a mountain, and grow our own corn and everything like that. That's not true, is it?
No. What characterizes libertarian thought is that each person is free to make such choices on his own, that he's free to determine the parameters of his life, so long as he does no harm to anyone else. And most of us as libertarians do want to live in a world with lots of other people who think as we do. And we don't want to go off in some remote area and be a Robinson Crusoe.
Certainly, if you want to, we can. We don't have a problem with that. But I think we want to live in a world where the relationships are more voluntarily, rather than the state saying, you give us this money through your taxation, and then we're going to provide for you if you're sick or in your old age or things like that.
That's right. Our rule is that unless you do harm to another person, to deprive them of their life or their property, their rights, you should be left alone. You should be able to live in peace with each other.
And I think even the founder, again, of FEE, he had a pamphlet or something titled Anything That's Peaceful, I think. So that certainly provides that. Well, Larry Reed of FEE, we're going to take our first break here in a moment. And then, Karl, I think you're going to be back with the questions. So we'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Karl Peterjohn. Our special guest today, Larry Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education. Karl, you had a question?
Yes, FEE's program has been deeply involved in working with young people.
Yes.
But recent polls have indicated that a growing percentage of American youth have positive or even very favorable impressions of socialism. I think that's a harbinger for problems in the future, but do you have any ideas on why this is happening and what can and should be done to try and correct it?
Well, it certainly underscores that we have a lot of work yet to do. But when you look beyond those polls, you'll find that young people have a much more friendly attitude toward certain elements of free markets that you don't normally associate in any way with socialism. You ask them about entrepreneurship, and they tend to be very friendly to it. They like the idea of starting a business and inventing things and marketing them, and they like the idea of freedom to be commercial. So in that sense, they're not true blue socialists. Many of them are, and I don't mean to underestimate the danger of the socialist idea. It's very tempting to a lot of people, but there's also there are a lot of good things at work at the same time, Karl. And I know that the students who come to our seminars seem to be turned on with even just 10 minutes of discussion about what freedom and free markets are all about. So when you say that there's a tendency to lean towards socialism, I think it's also very superficial and easily overcome if we just have a few minutes with them to present another side.
What's the best material to reach out to young people? If you're a parent of a teenager today, what would you recommend material that you could give to your son or daughter?
I think the younger the person, the younger the student, say high school over college, the more you've got to give them material that relies upon stories of real people. At FEE, we produce a lot of those kinds of things. Stories of real people who have been exemplars of character, whose lives are models, who left the world a better and freer place. If you just lecture to students about freedom and free markets, half of them will zone out after a few minutes. But if you can tell them real stories of real people and how their lives left others freer, I think you've got a better shot at convincing them.
I think you've written a book on that very subject.
That's right. It's called Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. And it's available on our website at fee.org.
Well, let me expand in terms of where we are at the moment. I was thinking back in the 20th century, I think back around the time Ronald Reagan became president, federal debt on the books was about $3 trillion. Today it's over $20 trillion, and the off-the-books federal debt's much, much higher. Have we passed a point of fiscal no return?
That's a very good question. I get it a lot on the road. You know that none of the federal debt has a maturity. None of the bonds, notes, or bills has a maturity beyond 30 years. So technically, if we had a balanced budget every year for the next 30, you could completely retire even that $21 trillion national debt. So in that sense, it's not yet, if retiring it is not unreachable. But it would require a level of fiscal discipline that we have not seen in this country perhaps since the days of Andrew Jackson, when for 2 years the debt was zero.
Well, let me play devil's advocate and cite an even worse example. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve prior to the 2008 Great Recession was under $800 billion. Today, the balance sheet has been expanded, some might say inflated, to between 4 and 5 trillion,
Yes.
increased 5 to 6 times. And that's a combination.
Carl, explain what that means. I mean, the balance sheet, what does that mean to the average person?
Well, for the average person, you've got an expansion of financial assets that have really been created out of thin air.
So the Federal Reserve is, we say, printing money, but most of that money exists as
The electronic digits.
right.
keeping
But they
it.
just made new money.
Yes, I like to cite the example, the Confederate States have been defunct since 1865. And when I was a boy, you could get Confederate currency almost for literally nothing. But try going to a coin or stamp store and get Confederate currency today in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
And you'll see which currency has actually appreciated in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
But let me throw that, because you've got the private sector as well as the public sector. It goes to the question in terms of character.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we have quite enough time to give you a full opportunity to answer that in terms of, you've got a wonderful essay, Are We Rome? And we're talking about both government debt and private debt and creation of money out of thin air. And it leaves us in an interesting position, which, Bob, I'm going to let you segue us out, and we'll get an answer after the
We will take a
break.
commercial break, and when we come back, we'll get Larry Reed of Foundation for Economic Education to answer that question. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks with Carl Peterjohn, our special guest, Larry Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education. Carl, you had just asked a pretty big question, I think, about the future of our money supply and what that holds for the future of our country as well.
And I also think Carl asked about the connection between that and character, so I'd like to toss that into my answer as well. I think these incredible numbers, 21 trillion in debt and now an annual budget deficit approaching $1 trillion, are signs of an erosion of character, certainly of the politicians who deliver that to us. They obviously haven't got the fiscal courage and integrity to balance their budget. But then it also raises questions, well, then how do they get elected and then do that or get reelected? It's because people support much of what they do. We don't hold them accountable. A people of solid character would demand of their politicians that they spend no more than they have, and that they reduce their spending to meet the shortfall in revenue. But we don't do that.
Yeah, and we've really become even worse since Donald Trump became president. The most recent legislation, we've cut taxes, but at the same time, I believe we increased spending. So, that's the seduction of inflation and also of debt. It allows you to give people stuff now without having to pay for all of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Milton Friedman said, don't look at taxes so much, but look at the level of spending, because we're going to have to pay for it at some time.
That's right. Government spending represents command of resources. And so even if they cut taxes but increase spending, their command of the resources of society has increased. And the worst example I can think of from the most recent spending bill, which was a monstrosity, is the fact that Betsy DeVos at the Education Department, she requested a $9 billion reduction in her budget. Okay, well, hallelujah. That's great when a bureaucrat does that. But instead, the Congress gave her an increase of $2.6 billion. So how are we ever going to balance the budget or reduce this debt when even department heads are overruled because the politicians want to spend so many billions more?
And some of these numbers we talk about, they're just huge, and it just strangles the imagination to think about them. But, you know, the economist Dan Mitchell, who I think contributes to FEE from time to time, he's said if we could just grow the public sector, government, at a slower rate than the private sector grows, then over time, like you mentioned, in 30 years, these problems can take care of themselves. So if we just make kind of, you know, we can't pay it all off tomorrow, but if we just make little corrections over the course of a lifetime, we can fix it.
As an elected official at the local level, that was a tool I tried to utilize, and it was also a tool that I had tried to utilize as an advocate for taxpayers at the State House, because legislators would say, well, you're up here wanting us to cut spending, which that was going to be a non-starter, and I'd say, no, my intent at this point is to try and get you to be fiscally responsible, and I was trying to convince them if they could limit the spending growth to roughly half the natural growth in revenue, making us more competitive, Kansas would move away from being a high tax point on the prairie, which unfortunately, with the recent legislatures and tax increases, we've restored to that dubious position. But try and follow what Mitchell was talking about in terms of limiting government growth to less than the private sector growth, and we can eventually grow out of it. But I don't know, historically, I can't cite an example where government has gotten so expansive as it is in the United States, where they've been successfully able to do that. Can you think of any example historically?
No, I
Larry?
can't. I think you're right on that. Now, maybe we can be the first. Doesn't mean that we can't yet turn it around, and there is time. But the hour is late. And, you know, one of the most alarming things to me right at the moment is you've got the economy, at least in terms of things like unemployment, at its best shape in 8 or 9 years. You'd think that with that kind of growth behind us, that we'd have something closer to a balanced federal budget because revenues are way up. But
That's the Keynesian argument.
That's right. But look what we've got. We've got the biggest annual deficit likely coming next year at a time when the economy's at 4% unemployment. What does that say about where the deficit might go in the next recession when unemployment goes to 8% or 12%?
You know, and conservatives are really upset. They say, look, we elected this Donald Trump who was going to do all sorts of things. We elected a lot of conservative members to the House of Representatives over the last decade, the Tea Party revolution. But, you know, there's really just the Freedom Caucus, a couple dozen representatives in the House that will vote against these spending increases, and the Democrats will vote against it simply because it's a Republican bill. But other than that, these spending increases go right through.
Well, you end up with these bipartisan monstrosities, like you mentioned, the most recent current resolution budget that dramatically increased federal spending and had bipartisan Democrat and Republican yes votes, even though the Freedom Caucus generally voted no. They were part of the minority. And so it leads us to your wonderful essay, Are We Rome? And how close are we on the road that Rome paved?
Well, certainly in the latter days of the Roman Republic, we saw many things that have echoes in today's policy. We saw the erosion of fiscal integrity. We saw the resort to the creation of new money and credit to stimulate a sick economy, and only to later suffer the price inflation that resulted from it. We saw the growth of government bureaucracy, handouts, the dole. There are a lot of similarities. And sooner or later, if that doesn't stop, and if it's not reversed, it becomes unsustainable and bankrupts the entire society. That's what happened with ancient Rome, and that's the path we're on if we don't turn it around.
And we may think we're just talking about economics, which is a dry subject, and make people think just numbers and tables and charts, but ask the people of Venezuela how important economics is to them, because they are truly suffering and may get worse before it gets better. Let's take our last commercial break on Wichita Liberty TV for today. We'll be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks with Karl Peter John and our special guest, Larry Reed of the Foundation for Economic Education. One of the things I think in your talk about Are We Good Enough for Liberty is the idea of humility. And one of the things you do to illustrate that, you include in that book, is the essay, I Pencil,
Yes.
which is something that really changed my outlook on, I want to say, life in the world when I first read it. Well, a simple piece of material like a pencil, people will give them to you if you just ask for them. No one thinks about them. But it's a tremendously complicated thing, the pencil, and it turns out that no one in the world knows everything that's necessary to make a pencil. So what kind of lessons do we draw from that?
That's a wonderful essay, a classic written by our founder, and we're coming up on the 60th anniversary of it.
Okay.
He wrote it in 1958. Eddie points out in that essay that no one person in the world knows how to make a pencil from scratch. Mm-hmm. If you had to rely entirely upon your own knowledge and not anybody else's contribution in any way, if you had to make a pencil from scratch, you wouldn't be able to do it. You'd have to be a logger, a miner, and endless other occupations. One of the many lessons from that is, or ought to be, intellectual humility. The idea that, wow, if I don't know how to build a pencil by myself, what does that say about my ability to centrally plan an economy of 325 million people? Mm-hmm. It tells you that learning ought to be a lifelong objective, and that if you make it so, no matter how many PhDs you may accumulate, by the time you're done, there'll still be a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know, as much as there ever was. That ought to make every person a bit humble. It ought to make you more introspective to realize, wow, even my own life is a full-time job, let alone trying to run the lives of other people.
And I think also a lesson of iPencil is, well, how do all these activities of people across the world get coordinated?
That's right.
To make a pencil? It's really a quite simple mechanism,
It's
isn't it?
totally amazing when you think of it, because there is no mastermind, there is no central planner, no king who says to the people, hey, you mine the graphite, you grow the trees, you make the stuff that we make the eraser out of. Nobody's ordered to do any of that. And yet it all comes together magically, it seems, simply by the power of incentive and the price system. The desire for on the part of each person to do better for himself, to find the skills that are marketable, that he can provide, work with others peacefully in the process, come together as if by magic to make all the component parts that become a pencil. And nobody does it because they just want to be nice to other people. They do it because there's something in it for them. So their self-interest is automatically and magically directed towards the satisfaction of endless others they don't even know.
And you said self-interest. I thought you were going to say greed there. But, I mean, greed we usually think of as a negative human aspect or emotion. But if we have, one of the things about character, I think you should point out that greedy people can manipulate government to give them stuff without really having worked for it.
That's right. How deep your so-called greed is, whether you make it the centerpiece of your life and worship at its altar, that's taking it to an extreme. Or if you use government to satisfy your greed at other people's expense, that's off the deep end.
Well, there's a lot of criticism of capitalism generically, and capitalists in particular, because of, and I think of the public-private partnership model, where we seem to have, privatize any profits, but more often the taxpayer ends up absorbing the losses.
That's right.
And how do you get out of this capitalism as the bad guy? Because I'm a firm believer in economic freedom, is the way I like to put it, as opposed to trying to defend capitalism, because there are a lot of capitalists out there I don't think are very defensible.
Well, it's important to understand that what you just described, Karl, is not real capitalism. The use of government by anybody to get something at other people's expense, to get an artificial advantage, to use the police power of government to go after their competition, or to stick it to the consumer, that's not capitalism. That looks a lot more to me like socialism, because it involves big government dispensing favors and subsidies and power that it shouldn't have. So true capitalism means voluntary interaction. the use of free markets, not manipulated markets that are dominated by crony connections with politicians.
And not just in the domestic market, but worldwide too. And that's
right.
something where our president now is getting ready to really restrict our freedoms to trade on a worldwide basis, I believe.
That's right, and one of the pretenses he's offering is totally fallacious, the idea of the balance of trade. Every day I hear him talk about how, we have a $500 billion trade deficit with China. But I have a trade deficit with Walmart, in the sense that I buy a lot more from them than they ever buy from me. But the balance of trade only looks at merchandise. It doesn't look at all the other things that people do in international commerce, the services they buy, the real estate investments they make, the treasury bills and financial instruments that they purchase. If you look at all those things, there's a much greater balance than if you look at only what the balance of trade measures.
Yeah, and that's kind of a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of people, even me sometimes, to really grasp that we're not getting, I don't want to say, ripped off by China and Mexico. This is voluntary trade between not the nations really, but people within those nations trading for each of their mutual benefit. And Karl, I think we've just run out of time. I'm sorry about that. But Larry Reed, Foundation for Economic Education, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.
FEE, the website, very easy to find. It's fee.org. We'll have that and other material in the show notes for today's episode. So thanks for watching. I'm Bob Weeks, and we'll be back again next week.